Chapter 12. When Ryan first came back into consciousness, he felt a searing pain in the right of his jaw. He moved his mouth slowly and heard a click as the joint pushed its way back into position, and he hissed through gritted teeth. He opened his eyes and realized that he could barely see, and it was as if he was looking through eye holes on a mask. And he was. He heard shuffling around him and looked around, crooking his neck after it had been still for so long. Ryan could make out a pink patch of Baz's hair and a grey of Ree's hair. He tried to say. Emphasis on tried. There was a tape over his mouth. However, his older friend knew what the muffled word was. He turned and looked towards his younger friend, his eyes barely visible through the small eye holes of the foxy mask. Two burr-like friends stared at each other, both thinking and fearing the same thing. "Pull on your tape!" Baz tried to call to his Freddy masked friend. He could see the confusion in Ryan's eyes. Pull on it! Every breath he took, or every word he tried to say, would cause his nostrils to burn. It didn't take a rocket scientist to realize his nose was broken. Baz could feel the edge of where the two ends of the tape overlapped each other. If they were pulled tighter, he could peel them apart. He shook his wrists. "Pull the tape!" He called out again, uncomfortably aware of how difficult it was to hear his own voice. Ryan hadn't yet realized they were tied down, and Baz could hear his friend panic as he shook his arms. The pink-haired man understood and was empathic. When he had first opened his eyes and realized the situation he was in, his chest went tight with terror. "Yes, keep doing that," Baz told his friend, knowing that his words were indistinguishable. Ryan shook his head and said another muffled phrase. He was hyperventilating. Baz got his wrist into the most uncomfortable of positions, but started picking at the edge of the tape. It didn't feel thick, it must have only been wrapped around once. If Will and Reese were awake to pull the bonds themselves, they could probably just pull it apart, but wishful thinking would get them nowhere. He picked at the corner until he felt something give way. With a smile that couldn't be seen, he began trying to grab hold of the little edge. Then Louis came back. Having learned from last time, Baz instantly played dead or unconscious. He left his head flop forward and kept his breathing even, as if he was sleeping. He wanted to scream at Ryan to do the same, but his younger friend was in the middle of panicking. He felt an arm lean over him and heard Ryan give some sort of muffled sob as his head was pulled backwards. The pink-haired man resisted the urge to move, remembering the strike to his forehead, the mask making the force seem worse. At the time it had stunned him, but he was still very aware of everything that happened. From that point, he had found it easier to think of their youngest friend not as Louis, but as someone else. He didn't know who, but it wasn't Louis who hit him. It wasn't Louis who had tied them up. Thinking that way helped to dull the pain of remorse he felt every time he looked at the white-eyed man. Until he somehow returned to normal, he wouldn't be Louis. But will he ever go back to normal? Louis stayed quiet, and Ryan fearfully looked into the younger man's dead eyes. There was no sympathy in them like there had been before. There were no kind and caring blue eyes to reassure Ryan that everything was going to be okay. No comfort that he would wake up from this nightmare anytime soon. The younger man's lips were pulled back to bare his teeth as he practically growled, the sound deep and low in his throat, as if a noise was echoing through the cavern. Will groaned and shuffled around very slightly. "No! Will! Stay silent!" Baz talked desperately. "Of all the times you could have woken up." With a sign of impatience, Lee shot Ryan's head forward and walked over to a table that had been set up in front of Baz. On top of it, there was nothing but a camera and a knife. Louis crouched down so that he was level with the table and picked up the camera. He fumbled around with it, his hands unexplainably shaking, before finally turning it on and starting a video. He adjusted the position of the camera's view and made sure everything was in focus. The corners of his lips twitched into a slight smile, and he began to stand up and turn towards Baz, dragging the knife off of the table. His face went blank and he gave another glance towards the camera. Will tried to say something, still only half conscious. He straightened his back very slightly and his head rolled to the other side. Louis watched him with a masochistic pleasure and bent towards the camera, giving it a menacing grin. "This is a message to Scott Kaftan," he said before getting up quickly and striding to Baz's side. He ripped the mask off of his friend's face, the bands that held it in place snapping with a dull tink. Baz forgot about the whole stink still rule, and he watched the red mask fly across the room and shatter against the wall. Is he talking about Scott Kaftan? If you don't make 50-20 mode easier! Louis grabbed hold of the front of Baz's pink hair and pulled it backwards to expose his neck. A lump formed in the pink-haired man's throat, which he struggled to swallow. His lip quivered under the tape. Wait, is this about the game? A cold strip of metal pressed against Baz's skin and he closed his eyes steadily. Don't move, don't you dare move a muscle. I'm going to slice his neck! Do you understand? I'm gonna... Fuck! Louis pushed his hand, which he held the knife in, to the side of its face, which contorted in pain. He clenched his hand into a fist and forced it down his side. Slit his neck, he murmured. He looked towards the camera and started to chuckle, his shoulders shaking as each laugh erupted from his mouth in uncontrollable waves. He walked towards the table, air being pushed through his teeth making strange sound whistles, and he leaned towards the camera. He smashed his fist on the table a few times in excitement and grabbed the camera in one jolty and broken up movement. Louis then approached the musician with the confidence of a predator who had cornered their prey and focused the camera on him. He put the knife in his back pocket and tore the mask off of the purple-haired man's face. Will looked confused and dazed as he looked forward, unsure as to why he could suddenly see a lot more. Louis roughly grabbed his older friend's chin and angled Will's face towards the camera. In his shock, all Will could manage to do was give a fearful, bewildered and muffled "Huh?" Louis grinned and giggled before dropping Will's face. The musician blinked and tried to focus his racing mind, panting in externation to remember what had happened. Baz was taking the opportunity to continue his attempts of pulling the tape apart. He finally had a good hold of the edge of it and began to pull it downwards. It was difficult, and the tape kept slipping through his sweaty hands. His face screwed up in concentration and he tried again and again. Each time the tape traveled a little further down, a little closer to freedom. Louis next came to Razz. He didn't have a mask. The laughing man briefly glanced at the broken chicken mask that had been thrown onto the sofa, the straps having broken and cracked the edges of the yellow plastic. It didn't matter. He looked back towards the unconscious Scotsman who had his shoulders leaning over the back of the chair, his neck and head hanging limply as he slowly regained consciousness. Blood had dried on his cheeks and his right eye was black with a bruise. His chest rose and fell in small breaths. His eyes were flickering behind the eyelids as he fought the urge to go back to his rest. Louis held the knife against Razz's throat and beamed with a malicious smirk as he realized how helpless the Scotsman was. He could just push a little harder into the skin, and he could do nothing about it. Louis shook in excitement. He had so many possibilities. He brought the knife away and kicked his older friend in the nether regions. That made him wake up. Next was Ryan, dear old pathetic Ryan. He was wriggling and squirming as he tried to break the bonds around his wrist. Louis gently pulled his mask off, and Ryan could do nothing but watch in overwhelming terror as the grin on Louis' face somehow evolved into that of the Cheshire Cat. A mischievous, toothy grin which gleamed in the low light of the setting sun outside. He said something beneath the tape and the younger man giggled, shaking his head at the useless attempt. Is this literally because of the 50-20 mode? It can't be, that's ridiculous! Ryan docked as arguments swerved through his head. Louis panned the camera around to the pink-haired man who looked away, refusing to make eye contact with him. This irritated the unstable man, and he growled with anger. Baz shook his head in a defiant manner. Louis strode over to the table and almost smashed the camera on its surface. He glared at Baz and angled the camera back towards the group. Reese was wriggling. Will was still confused but becoming more active. Ryan hadn't changed his actions and Baz looked like he was concentrating, probably trying not to cry. Louis talked with a smirk. He crouched down back in front of the camera and stared at it. "Scott?" he whispered, his face beaming with sickly sweet happiness. Baz tugged at the tape, his fingertips feeling raw and the joints in his wrist aching. He was almost there. He was so close. Louis' voice increased in volume as he said the next phrase. "I'm giving you 24 hours!" It practically ended in a shout that was followed by an aggressive yell. There was a ripping noise. In the camera screen, Louis saw the pink-haired man suddenly fly up out of his seat. He ripped off the tape around his mouth and lunged towards his younger friend in one fluid movement, before shoving Louis to the floor. "Go!" Baz yelled at the group. Will suddenly felt adrenaline push through his veins as he leapt to his feet, ignoring the head rush it gave him before sprinting to the front door. He tore off the tape that stuck to him, ripping off a few of the hairs on his arms, but he didn't notice as he was more concerned with getting the tape off of his mouth. He swiped the front door key from the sofa nearby and shoved it into the keyhole. It opened with a satisfying click, and he kicked the doors open before sprinting out into the outdoors, which was blanketed in a red hue from the sun that settled on the horizon, sending long shadows of trees along the road. Ryan was up quickly and legged it towards the open door, following closely behind Will. "Get out!" Baz shouted at Reese as the older man shook his head to clear his foggy brain. Everything was happening too fast to properly process. Ryan grabbed Reese's arm, pulling him along as he noticed his slowed state. They burst into the open and followed Will. Although Reese's brain was clearing quickly, he only knew one thing for certain. They had to run. Baz was the furthest from the door. In their rush, his friends had knocked over the chairs and they lay across the floor like a low barrier. He hopped over the first two perfectly fine, but the last one was his downfall. Literally. Liz was close behind him, furiously screaming at everyone. The approaching danger made Baz reckless. He jumped over the last chair, but didn't see the cup of tea that had been knocked over onto the floor. His foot landed and slid. He crashed to the floor and landed on the right side of his knee. If you had to describe the noise that was made as the kneecap slid out of place, it would be a mix of stone grinding on stone along with a sickening pop. He cried out in anguish as thoughts of his incoming fate filled his head. Louis kicked the pink-haired man out of the way and rushed out to the door, stopping at the banister that went around the bridge that linked the cabins together. His breathing deepened in rage as he watched the three figures spring into the distance, listening to the purple-haired man's yells at the group to run. It had stopped raining at some point, but the ground glistened like shimmering fire. The air was thick, as if it could be cut with a knife. The unstable man contemplated chasing them, but instead he looked towards his unfortunate friend inside the cabin, who was trying to push himself off the floor. Louis grinned at the disappearing group. They'll be back. After all, would they leave their friend behind? No. And besides, they were running the wrong way if they wanted to get out of the park. They'll be back eventually. His wide eyes slowly turned towards the pink-haired man. He marched back inside, slamming the door closed behind him. Baz looked towards him and watched his doom approach. He gritted his teeth and scowled. "What did we do? What did any of us do, Louis?" he exclaimed. "What the fuck is wrong with you? Don't you remember who we are or something?" He wasn't letting himself go without a fight. He heaved himself into a painfully uncomfortable sitting position and shuffled backwards. Louis gazed upon the pitiful man, a feeling of grief pulsing from deep within his mind. He briefly looked away at the wall to distract himself from the thought. "Look at me!" Baz commanded. Look me in the eye! Louis complied for a reason he couldn't explain. He locked eyes with the older man. Tell me you remember me! All those memories we had together, the videos and shit! That game of gold I let you win! Baz joked with a heavy heart. Tell me you remember that! Tell me you still recognize me, right? You know who I am! Louis grimaced and watched the pink-haired man as a tear rolled down his blood-stained face, his hair sticking to his forehead as it had been cemented in place by perspiration. There was fear in his eyes, but there was also hope. Baz looked right back into the younger man's eyes. There was hesitancy and doubt. There was the shimmer of sadness. For a brief moment, his eyes seemed to flicker as a bleeding light of blue jumped across his irises. Louis heard something, but he couldn't work out where it came from. The noise came from nowhere and everywhere, from around him and within him, an echoing cry that cascaded through his mind. He looked back towards the wall. Shut up! Do you remember me? Baz pleaded. Louis shivered and clenched his fists. He looked towards the pink-haired man and shoved whatever thoughts that were leaking into his mind deep down into the depths of his consciousness. His eyes faded back to white and he grabbed Baz by the collar of his zip-up hoodie. No, I don't. The thing is, he was telling the truth.